Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so I should apologize as well in one respect, in that I'll just be talking about politics full on, and through the lens of these medium, if you like. I should also say that for the past 7 years, I've been doing some research on the intersection of art and citizenship, and specifically activist art and social practice and citizenship. That's through the politics department at Goldsmiths College, and I'm about to just submit a thesis. I'm rather late to this, but the reason I undertook some research, doing a PhD through an academic department, it was really to better investigate this kind of intersection of journalism and art, and how what one can do with that as a form of art practice, if you like. But these newspapers were developed and implemented as a component of this research. However, the idea of combining these journalistic techniques with art practice preceded the work on the thesis and will continue following completion. 2 more papers are planned, and I've just recently received some funding from the Canada Arts Council that's going into the research for what will be the 3rd edition or the 2nd edition of this particular. Clouded Tidal is the most recent publication, and so this one will be a follow-on from some of the thematics in Clouded Tidal. And I'm hoping to have those launched in 2019 to 2020. So before discussing the political doing of these art interventions, I'd like to flag up some of the background considerations that led me to using the printed form of the newspaper as an artistic medium. And this will bear on my discussion of the kind of doing of politics through art interventions and the overlap between art, aesthetics, and politics. And also, too, I just want to say a few things about the way I'll be using the word aesthetics. I understand the term to encompass various meanings, and I think part of the overall discussion when we're using the word aesthetics, I'm always trying to listen out as to how it's applied and what's being implied by the word. But I always have in mind, if you like, its use in describing the formal properties of an artwork. So say, for example, the lines, colors, planes, etc. within a frame, through to affect, our emotions, and indeed including the visceral experience of things, and of course percept, sensory experience, but also the idea, kind of more recently kind of come across this aesthesis, this idea of aesthesis, so discriminations made through sensory experience. Also, too, 20 years ago or so, I did a little bit of work as an undergraduate in philosophy on J.J. Gibson's work, his writing on affordances and the structural invariance of objects in visual perception. And some of this study was greatly helped by the philosopher Marjorie Green, and it was through discussions with her that the notion of affordances has become embedded in my understanding of sensed phenomena. So when thinking about aesthesis as including discrimination, this idea of judgments that are not propositional statements, but nevertheless are a kind of judgment, it's interesting to think about the kind of knowledge claims that come through our aesthetic, this kind of aesthetic registers. So anyway, I also have in mind Gibson's idea of affordances in these cases. So, for example, what does that mean? So, for example, we'll say the phenomena of objects that present themselves to us, and using Gibson's terminology, kind of afford meanings and usages as one thing or another. So, for example, certain surfaces, it could be a boulder or a ledge, etc., can afford themselves as chairs. So I think I'm kind of have a Gibsonian understanding of how meaning is implicit in the kind of array, the visual array or the optical array of objects. I'd just also like to just briefly outline what the aesthetic objectives are for producing these interventions as newspapers. I became interested in the printed form of the newspaper because of its liminal qualities. That is, as an artifact, it is strikingly odd, I would argue, even slightly archaic, and it has a particular aesthetic register that is enhanced, in my view, by it being slightly outdated form of communication. Its aesthetic oddness is brought to the fore in comparison to, say, the aesthetic register of the screen or a window frame or the interface of our computers in acquiring news. I think we might agree that the computer screen as a surface and as a window is experientially kind of ordinary and routinized as a medium for the acquisition of information and news. And one might say, following Harman, although I'm not suggesting that this captures what his deeper claims are with regard to objects, but nevertheless, what one might say is that the screen is in the background, if you like, of our awareness. And the printed newspaper, by comparison, is a communication medium in transition. On the one hand, it is slightly antiquated, as I've suggested, but on the other hand, it retains the vestiges of a kind of authority as a medium of public knowledge. And it's this slippage, the breakage in its technology, that makes it compelling as an artistic medium. The printed form of the newspaper oscillates between being ordinary, and therefore in the background, and extraordinary, that is visible to us as an aesthetic object in its own right. It comes into view through this kind of oddness of its aesthetic register, and there is a set of affordances, if you like, that present themselves in this technological, social, and cultural shift that make the newspaper, in my view, a ripe medium for artistic experimentation and communication. Also, it's interesting to consider the newspaper as an artistic medium in the context of the debates about fake news, which are actually historically rooted in the 19th century, and discussions about what was called the yellow press and the production of sensationalist tabloid news, or indeed currently in the kind of post-truth politics, populist politics, that appeal to people's emotions and or are intentionally misleading. Fake news obviously troubles the idea of the newspaper as presenting facts about the world. And I think this is why, in part, the arguments about fake news have some purchase. They draw attention to the aesthetic complexity of this form of communication and the way in which politics is framed through the medium. These art interventions, therefore, experiment with the aesthetics of facts. It's this idea of a fact. What is a fact? But the facts as presented and perceived, in particular and within the printed form. How can one stretch and exploit the aesthetic qualities of the facts and the evidence of matters of concern, but also, importantly, unlike fake news, not misrepresent what is at issue? How can facts then, that purport to represent a public discourse, be differently arranged to make visible other facts that are elided, or not visible? I'll talk about this in a more detail when I turn to the specific examples of the papers. So, exploring how creative assemblages of the facts, if you like, that is the editing, arrangement, and visual display of these facts, can yield multivalent readings of the facts and in turn suggest or facilitate new imaginaries is a kind of key objective, or at least part of, really kind of central to my exploration in using this medium. The newspaper is also conceived as an interventionist tool. That is, as a tool, it has the ability to carve out different kinds of publics. So, for example, as an artwork, it is legible as an artistic intervention to those who have the requisite knowledge. That is, they've been informed that it is an artwork, they are reasonably familiar with contemporary debates in art and aesthetics, dematerialization, expanded practice, social practice, interventionist art, activist art, artivism, etc. These are all kind of conceptual, kind of elements of what would facilitate the reading of that object as an artwork. Otherwise, the newspaper as an artwork is invisible to readers. This inside and outside of reading the object is of interest, as it also troubles the idea of a public readership. That is, what kinds of publics can be shaped by art interventions of this kind, where readers are situated either inside or outside the artwork and its aesthetics. Also, as an interventionist tool, the newspaper can present an assemblage of content in such a way as to bring to the fore perspectives that sit outside of mainstream media. So mainstream media that, of course, also shapes publics and establishes normative assumptions of and for its readership as a public. Yeah? So there is what newspapers do in terms of how they also carve out a kind of publics within the scope of their readership. As an interventionist tool, the the Citizen Artist newspapers present readers with a thought experiment that is dialogical in character. The familiar techniques of journalism, the aesthetics of mainstream journalism, for example, the chronological or narrative story structures, feature stories, shorthand opinion pieces, etc., is put aside. Not only do the Citizen Artist newspapers focus on a single topic, but the content is layered in meaning so as to facilitate multiple readings. The facts are not presented in ways that meet the expectations of news as quick and digestible stories, and reading these newspapers requires carefully scrutinizing and reflecting upon the visual imagery while assessing the content of the writing. Facts here are presented using academic techniques such as compact structured arguments, citations, footnotes, etc., and are undergirded by images that problematize the topic under discussion. The information is densely presented so as to slow down the reader and prompt engagement with the intersection of visual and text-based information. And one might say that the aesthetics of journalism are contested within the aesthetics of Citizen Artist newspapers, if you like. And there's also an aesthetic dimension to the newspaper as originating from one person and not an organization or an agency. The intention of the artwork is to trouble notions of authority and the authoritative voice that is part of the posture of a newspaper's historical, social, cultural, and political legacy. Instead, these interventions kind of riff off of, or I don't know how else to express that, but kind of riff off of investigative journalism and its cachet for revealing truths, if you like. That's kind of embedded in our expectations of mainstream broadsheet kind of news. The artworks are intended to trouble what is visible as normative, and I have in mind here some of Rancière's idea about disruption and partitioning of the sensible, where the editorial role kind of slips into the background to bring to the fore an assemblage and arrangement of voices and perspectives on a topic not present, or rather not conceivable even, in this form, in the domain of mainstream media. And as I see it again, the newspaper is therefore not only an artistic medium, but an aesthetic tool, and it's also a political tool where its aesthetic and political characteristics kind of intersect. So what I'll do now is I'll just turn to the discussions of the two newspapers as a way of drawing out how these interventions kind of do politics, that I hope will also open up a way of thinking about these newspaper interventions as public things. So in April 2018, 1,100 copies were printed of Clouded Title, so the what is that, right-hand side, of Clouded Title. And I'm going to talk about Clouded Title first, and then I'll talk about the earlier publication. But so 820 copies were posted to the homes of residents on Pender Island, with a settler population of approximately 2,600 permanent residents, via the Canadian Postal Services. Copies are also available at a newsstand now in the local supermarket. 2 weeks after posting copies of the paper to residents, a day-long public art and research workshop of the same name was hosted in collaboration with the artist Emily Artinian, who is here with me, and Emily is the founder of Street Road Artist Space in Pennsylvania. And the research workshop not only facilitated the formal launch of the paper, but it also accompanied the installation of artworks that are part of an extended exhibition held at Street Road, also called Clouded Title. So the focus of this art intervention is on a key historical colonial document called the Douglas Treaty, North Saanich, because of the district it encapsulates, if you like, because it is an artifact that captures and reinforces and indeed antagonizes foundational differences and contested relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living in a small region of southwestern Canada, the southern tip of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. So I just want to show you here. So here we've got the map of Canada, and I did my best to give you a kind of close-up, and you can see the little blob here, and this is the Pender Island, and that's where these papers were distributed to. I just want to point out these dots. Those dots are the general location of what are the reservations of the Saanich for First Nations groups, communities, and those 4 dots are the oh, great, and I can point. Do I just press? Oh, fantastic, thank you. Okay. Yes, so these are what are now the territories where the communities are, where these reservations are located, if you like. This map here shows what is the traditional territory of the Saanich Nation. And there are subgroups within the Saanich Nation. So I should say, I'll be talking about the Tsayout. I'm mostly in contact with people from Tsayout Nation. This is all that remains of their traditional territory in terms of what happened under the Douglas Treaty. So I'm talking about the treaty that determined the kind of usurpation of this land, if you like. So I'll just to give you some sense of where we are. Yeah, so like that would be, you can see like this section here is really just this tiny section there. So their territory was rather extensive. It was also included the San Juan Islands, which is now the United States. The Canadian and American border is this black line here, and it cut off sections of their territory. Here. Where they're located, these were just their winter villages. And they're semi-nomadic, but also have specific locations within their territory that are also permanent locations, if you like. A very profoundly different way of understanding land, which I hope will come through the discussion. Okay. So the Douglas Treaty, North Saanich, afterward, from now on I'll refer to it as the Douglas Treaty or simply Treaty, is named after James Douglas, a 19th century figure who was a chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company and later representative of the British Crown as colonial governor. The treaty itself, however, is an expression of a British colonial and now a Canadian colonial desire to control and exploit land, not only for the extraction of resources such as fishing, mining, logging, etc., but also land development and the real estate market. It is also an important document in what it leaves out, namely the local indigenous Saanich Nation's own description of the treaty, its purpose as an agreement, and their own attitudes to land and non-human forms of life. My art intervention sets out to examine settler claims of ownership and entitlement to land that in turn justifies the existence of the state and fuels assumptions about belonging and membership. And I contrast the Douglas Treaty and the implications of its interpretation as a contract with Indigenous understandings of place and presence by including a Saanich Nation cosmological story within the pages of the newspaper. So pages 2 and 3, and the reason I brought copies was that it's significant about where that seam is. It's important about how, if you go to turn to that page, you'll see that those 2 pages come apart. And so the seam here is to indicate the thing. And you will see that in the reading, you know, the seam is going to be significant for I'll say more in a minute. So the newspaper is an assemblage of primarily direct quotes from published literature by Wisanic and other indigenous authors on the subject of ownership through the lens of the Douglas Treaty. I was careful to combine direct quotes in such a way as to outline a series of arguments that draw attention to the connections between the suppression of Wisanic perspectives on the treaty's making and the current colonial management of Wisanic and their lands. To give some context, the Saanich sources of literature are not widely known, nor is the viewpoint of the Saanich people about the Douglas Treaty and its meaning understood or acknowledged within the local community of Pender Island, or more widely even within the province. Equally, there is considerable ignorance on the part of the settler community that Pender Island is unceded territory. Remembering what I was showing you earlier, just to give you an idea about what I'm talking about is unceded territory. The Douglas Treaties, North Saanich is just this section here. The treaty applies to just that section. Pender Island, therefore, is on the outside. All of this is unceded. So parts of Saanich Nation here, for the rest of their territory, it's unceded, meaning it was never under. It's not under treaty. Yeah. Okay. So the issue of the appropriation of land is only beginning to enter public discussion within Canada, with some mention in the mainstream press that is unfortunately often shallow. I won't go into detail as to about what is said exactly, but nevertheless, it's very shallow, very sensationalist, very kind of glib and trite. At the local level of Pender Island, the issue of ownership and the appropriation of land is not only openly or publicly, is not openly or publicly discussed. Public discussions of the core issue of the Crown's appropriation of lands and the real consequences for the lives and living conditions of the Saanich people today is still widely avoided. One example is that the Saanich continued to be restricted to living on and having rights to only what was deemed to be the reserved lands, those little dots I pointed to, under the Douglas Treaty, small tracts of land that are the sites of their ancestral villages. Ancestral meaning they go back several thousand years, I should say. They've inhabited these territories for there's a burial site on Pender. It's dated back to 5,000 years. So they've been present in this place for a very, very long time. Yes. So as a consequence of the lack of public knowledge of the details that surround the question of ownership, fictions of entitlement persist on the island of a glossed settler history that falsely asserts that there was a sale of lands by the indigenous people to early settlers. The consequences of these elisions in the local context sustains public ignorance of not only the rights and title of the Saanich and to their traditional lands, but also perpetuates the kind of ongoing abuses and suppression of Wisanic Nation under state legislative practices, such as the scrutiny and management of Indigenous bodies, their identity, and indeed their lands within the state's citizenship regime. There's not enough time to talk about that. That's the kind of core of my thesis that I've been working on, is the kind of interrogating the kind of citizenship regimes, etc. I can't go into detail, but nevertheless, it will come up in some respects. But importantly, the lack of knowledge of the details of the Saanich perspectives also prevents real understanding of a more complex Saanich conception of membership that includes non-human beings. Therefore, the newspaper was designed to invite settlers on the island, I should say a population that is primarily of British ancestry, to engage with the thought experiment. The introductory article on the front page of the newspaper explains the purpose of the publication, and it explicitly invites readers to explore, quoting, to explore the different orientations of settler Indigenous conceptions of inhabiting land. It also explains that, I'll just read out one section of it. As a proviso, this publication does not represent the Saanich Nation nor residents of Pender Island. It speaks for neither community. Instead, it's an assemblage of published material from Saanich and other indigenous and non-indigenous writers, accompanied by sections of commentary intended to draw out some of the intricacies of the language of the treaty, to illustrate and examine different notions and practices of ownership. And readers will find that there is no singular explanation, and barring some suggestions, no solutions to its problems are posed. And I also warn that to expect answers or directives is to miss the point of the publication. The aim is to evaluate the implications of living on lands that are literally clouded in title. So therefore, the newspaper juxtaposes two narratives, the Douglas Treaty on the one hand, and the Saanich cosmological story that are, as you can see, displayed on adjacent pages of the newspaper. On the left-hand side is the full text of the Douglas Treaty, describing an alleged sale of Saanich lands to James Douglas. On behalf of who's obviously operating on behalf of the British Crown. On the right-hand side is displayed the cosmological story of Entails, the transformer, who not only transformed some of the Saanich people into islands, thus creating non-human ancestors of those Saanich people today, but who also ascribed reciprocal obligations of care and stewardship and life support to the two parties, both to humans and non-human beings, as islands, if you like. So as Robert Clifford says, the story of Entails is not about land, but deeply informed by the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations. That is, as a system of mini-social contracts that determines not only membership, that is, who is encompassed by this traditional ancestral story, but also as a set of concepts and principles that expand the domain of membership. That is, the inclusion of the lives of animals and non-human beings. And again, the island is understood as a being, as a non-human being, within the community. I should say here, not only are these key phrases, not only are key phrases within the two texts accompanied by detailed footnotes that draw out the complexities of their claims. Specifically, each footnote problematizes the claims of a phrase by drawing together historical analysis with contemporary issues, and in some cases citing examples in the popular press as evidence of the popularization of the colonial imaginary. So just to make it clear, what you're looking at is a very unconventional kind of strategy of using academic techniques, if you like, of research and citations. This is primarily direct quotes, in some cases paraphrasing, but also attending each of these kind of, as you can see, like these are highly footnoted. So every phrase becomes quite loaded, and it cross-references with the kind of body of text that is rather oppresses. But so you can see here there's 17 quotes, and here footnotes, I should say, and then 2 here. I'm just going to, so as you can see, like as you flick through those pages, you're kind of overcome in some way with the density and complexity of the task at hand. So not only, hang on, where am I? Sorry. Also, both of these texts, the Treaty and the Story of Entails, are superimposed on the image from a postcard published in 1955 of a Royal Mounted Policeman and an Indian chief, that's Chief Sitting Eagle, shaking hands. Their clasped hands, the handshake, are positioned at the center seam of the newspaper. It's important to note that the postcard was produced during the peak of extensive violence toward Indigenous people across Canada, and speaks to the hypocrisy, indeed, of the Canadian state and its legacy of whitewashing and propagandizing. In a caption, I introduce the image to readers in the following way. So I'm talking about this caption here, just in here. It says, the staged handshake suggests good relations and clemency between the state and Indigenous peoples by focusing on the popular modern European practice of shaking hands following promises, settlements, or contractual arrangements, in addition to being a formal symbol of trust. This propagandistic image is a salutary reminder of how pictures of a beneficent Canada have circulated within the country and abroad during moments of extensive state violence toward Indigenous peoples. The description on the back of the postcard is strikingly ironic. It exposes the publisher's efforts to historicize relations between settler and First Nations in its gloss celebration of Canada. The legend on the back of the original postcard reads, "Mountie and Indian Chief, here are symbols of Canada's glorious past. A Mountie, resplendent in his famed scarlet, greets Chief Sitting Eagle, one of Canada's most colourful Indians." I should say, I mean, I can't speak to the context fully here, but from the late 1800s through to 1996, there was a system of residential schools where all Indigenous children were kind of either kidnapped or somehow taken from people's homes and, in essence, incarcerated within these residential schools, which were often violent. Children experienced sexual abuse, torture, humiliation. They were punished if they spoke their language. They weren't able to wear their traditional clothes. They were literally just kind of broken down. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had produced a report which came out in 2013 and 2015. The final report came out discussing the violence in detail. So I just want to say that Canada's reputation as a kind of a happy, sweet, kind of clean, good example of civil society is really problematic for me, knowing, and indeed increasingly for Canadians, knowing that the real history is starting to emerge. So this intervention, if you like, kind of comes in at a moment when this is still very raw material. So by making use of a well-known artistic strategy, as you all know, of the kind of detonemo or culture jamming, the caption and the use of the image co-opts and problematizes this propagandistic signification of colonial or police state violence, but also the image draws attention to the connotations of a treaty as a promise, a mini social contract, that, like the handshake within the pages of the newspaper, can and have come apart. Equally, the design of these two pages underpins one of the key issues that are interrogated in the newspaper, namely the disputed interpretations of the meaning of the Douglas Treaty. The state insists that the treaty is a transfer of land title, and the Saanich people understand it as a peace treaty, a settlement for harm done by James Douglas and his men, this is in the 1900s, on their territory, and importantly as a set of promises for compensation and a future peaceful conduct. So the idea of promises are redolent in the reading of the footnotes, but also as a visual cue here, and how the handshape operates in terms of, coming apart, if you like, is there to do that work of underpinning it. So as a way of further emphasizing these contested understandings of the treaty, the discussion of the cosmological story does two things. First, it further evidences the Saanich claim that the treaty was a peace agreement and not a sale of land by introducing readers to Saanich understandings of relations to place. That's the story of Geel, describes the creation of the islands and the covenant between the islands, and the islands being, of course, that are the Saanich people's ancestors. So this covenant between the islands as their ancestors and humans, i.e. themselves, a compact that is foundational to an orientation to land, the islands, as vibrant forms of non-human life and beings that one is intrinsically connected to through time, in virtue of kinship, and indeed in terms of the practicalities of sustaining one's own life. The idea of one selling the world to which one belongs is highly implausible and indeed kind of absurd. absurd. Second, by contrasting these two texts, the thought experiment therefore invites readers to reflect upon the layered and complex implications of British Canadian appropriation of land as a basis for belonging and membership. After all, my citizenship as a Canadian depends on my being born on the soil. It's a jure soli, yeah? And in terms of my entitlement is justified through that claim, whereas Indigenous people they have a different status, they're categorized differently, and their status is in terms of their blood. So there's this already severing of connection between land and membership, which is, I think, very deeply important and significant in terms of the legislation around and the continuing practices of the colonial project, if you like. So the newspaper therefore exposes how the Douglas Treaty, as an alleged legal contract, lays bare the conflation of skewed, asymmetrical interpretations of the treaty and assumptions about entitlement that play out within the non-Indigenous population. Through the eyes of the Saanich, we learn that the treaty is not a contract, but a set of ongoing undertakings and promises meant to be based on annual review and discussion. It's a dialogue, and assurances to live well and remain self-sufficient. That's the understanding. So to quote a brief passage of the newspaper again, as J.R. Miller says, Canada until very recently has insisted that the written version of the treaties, which its treaty commissioners and bureaucrats had drawn up, of course, were the sole and complete account of what had been agreed. Consequently, the government has usually refused to interpret treaty commitments as anything other than the literal words of its version of the treaty. So, for example, if a treaty said that members of the First Nation that signed it in 1870s are each entitled every year to $5, then that is what they get in the early 21st century. In short, the federal government has generally interpreted and applied treaties as contracts, reading them in strict literal fashion. For the First Nations, this reading is a perversion of what the agreements were about. They take the position that the treaties were not just contracts and disagree that the full meaning of the treaties is found in the government's published version. Instead, First Nations approached treaty making in search of a connection with the incoming people and the Crown. They were looking for assurances and friendship and future support that would guarantee their survival. For them, the meaning of the treaties is found in the relationship established rather than any specific clause, and the overall significance of treaties to them is that they were promised to help to live well. So in other words, the Saanich were seeking to establish these kind of this miniature civil society by securing political agreements through formal promises annually reviewed with an ongoing dialogue. The newspaper therefore highlights how the state's misrepresentation of a historical commitment to the Saanich people, indeed its feigned blindness to Saanich interests and concerns, continues to inform current fictions of settler entitlement. It also draws attention to the misuse and continuing, and I would argue, willful abuse of formal agreements at a state level that in turn aggravate the very idea of belonging and membership, and I would say across the board for everyone. That is, at a formal level of the state, promises have been broken and ignored, and I would argue that the sharp dealing of the Crown, that's a quote from the pages in the sharp dealing of the Crown has been achieved without recompense, because the promises of the peace treaty are not embedded or embodied in the practices and understanding of people who reside within the domain of the Saanich Nation, within their traditional territory, and they're not embedded or they don't inform our daily life. There is no open dialogue between island residents and those Saanich, and the legacy of this is rooted in the early attitudes and practices of the settlers and the state. Opening up a space of dialogue is therefore one of the objectives of the newspaper. Yeah, it therefore is aimed at making visible, if you like, the facts on the ground via the assemblage of Saanich writings and perspectives. And this assemblage of Saanich perspectives trouble assumptions about who we are, what we claim to be, and alerts readers to the problems and contradictions of settler claims to ownership of land that are sanctioned by the crown and constitute the foundation of the state. The paper therefore challenges settler colonial narratives of entitlement that underpin these statist articulations of belonging and membership. Another theme of the paper is the differing conceptions of relations to land, where land, rocks and soil and trees, etc., is conceived by our kind of Western imaginary, is conceived as inanimate stuff or a substance. By the kind of colonial state and the settler imaginary. The newspaper outlines a key argument in John Locke's discussion on property. That's in his second treatise of government. That was applied within the colonies to justify the appropriation of land. Locke outlines how land is a material to be used, and the use of land is foundational to the justification for appropriation, ownership, and dominion over land. Dominion over land also translates into the concept and practices of jurisdiction over discrete patches of terrain. And this reductive notion of land as a substance or dead stuff sharply contrasts with Saanich relations to land as non-human ancestral beings or kin relations. Furthermore, the relationship between humans and non-human beings involves reciprocal obligations of provision and care, protection from harm, etc. And to illustrate this point, the following passage, I'll just recount the Saanich nation's origin story of entails to draw out the quality and complexity of these relations to land as a non-human being. So the story, as reproduced there, is a long time ago, when the creator entails walked the earth, there were no islands in Saanich Nation territory. The islands that are there today were human beings, our ancestors. At this time, entails walked among the Saanich people, showing them the proper way to live. In doing this, he took a bunch of those Saanich people and threw them back into the ocean. Each of the persons thrown into the ocean became the islands there today. Each of those islands were given a particular name, and a name that reflects the manner in which they landed, their characteristics or appearance, or the significance they have to the Saanich people. James Island, which was named after James Douglas by himself actually, was named Theltos. Theltos meaning splashed in the face. Theltos reflects the way the island landed in the ocean. The southeast face of Theltos is worn by the wind and the tide. And after throwing the Saanich people into the ocean, entails turned to speak to the islands and said, "Look after your relatives, the Saanich people." entails then turned to the Saanich people and said, "You will also look after your relatives of the deep. This is what entails asked us in return for the care of our relatives of the deep, who provide for us." Now, it's clear from the story that the Saanich do not describe their territory in terms of ownership, but as a reciprocal relationship between members of different bodily form. Implicit in the story is not the designation of authority over or between members, but a binding compact of caring and stewarding, sharing and distribution. And this complex relation has been expressed as being owned by the land, which suggests that the land has a principal agential role. For example, in a publication titled the Say Out Marine Use Study, the following description of the notion of ownership and its implications for membership is outlined as follows. To quote, "Prior to the signing of the North Saanich Treaty in 1852, the subsequent creation of discrete reserves and the creation of bands under the Indian Act," again, that's how they've been organized into those small little dots that I pointed out, "the Saanich comprised a single group." So prior to the treaties, the Saanich comprised a single group or not of extended families who share the Senchothan language and cultural order that revolved around their relations with marine creatures. creatures, some terrestrial animals, spirit beings, and with one another. The Sanish families exploited different ecological niches within the Sanish world, tailoring their seasonal movements according to the timing of local events. Such a pattern meant that one family knot could acquire through trade with another family knot what could not be procured locally. Seo members rarely say that they own the locations of their, say, for example, their fisheries. But instead they say they're descended from the fisheries, or they gloss it as we're owned by them. Yeah, we're owned by the islands, or we're owned by the land, or we're owned by that fishery, that kind of place of fishing, if you like. And it's a complex system of belonging that links kinship and community to territory and animal relatives. So this speaks to a profoundly different orientation to place. One's relation to land is not to dead innate matter, rocks and soil, etc., but to other vivid life forces such as the islands that are intrinsically connected to one's own existence, kin group, and ancestral history. In the story of Gales in particular, not only are the Sanish required to care for the land, but by acknowledging the codependence of human and non-human entities, the cosmological story widens the category of political membership. The Sanish people and the islands are imbricated within this relationship. Land itself has an agential role and is equally involved in the task of sustaining the life of humans and other animals. One might say that it affords life to human beings. And the content of the paper therefore introduces readers to another understanding of this kind of aesthesis of place, and indeed of the expanded political community to include non-human beings. And it pushes back at this reductive materialist imaginary of land as dead matter, and in turn its use, if you like, as undergirding this sort of sensibility of entitlement. And it points up the ethical implications of broken promises between settler and indigenous agreements, and pinpoints some of the key philosophical reference that shape and justify the Crown's political actions. And it takes to task, if you like, the reader in the production of a system of apartheid that continues to today. I just want to kind of quickly flick through the pages. So again, this body of text, all the notes that go with Gales, the cosmological story. Am I running out of time? Okay? I'm okay? Okay. And then the photograph in the... I should say the images and the text are cross-cited, if you like. There are these cross-citations. So this is a photograph about the protocols that they follow in order to gain access. This is to contrast the very different imaginaries of ownership as through mapping. Notice, like, this is about property, and these lines all describe, of course, what we're familiar with, are the boundaries or edges of a patch of land. Very differently understood. Again, this is this Seo Nation map of the overall Saanich Nation territory. But notice these are little dots. They don't. The map I initially showed you with a border or an edge, they don't see fences. They don't recognize or acknowledge fences, and they see that as a really problematic for them. There's a really, even in terms of its mapping and the visuality, if you like, of these different orientations to place are articulated, as I say, in these kind of visual ways. So they would not acknowledge the boundary necessarily, that these are dots or locales of movement. Here is, like, that's the Douglas Treaty North Saanich just in here. And these are all the Douglas treaties. There are 14 treaties in total, but the North Saanich applies to the Saanich, and they're composite groups. And the last page is the citations for all of the references. And this is a shot on Pender Island. There's one small piece of reserve lands on Pender Island, and this is like there's a resort that is literally right beside it. So I photographed just how, almost like an arrow into what is this sort of reserve land here, a part of the reserve. Citizen Artist News was, again, a single topic paper, and again had a distribution with inside of London. And like Clouded Title, as I say, it kind of hones in on, again, this kind of multivalent readings. And the point I want to kind of draw attention to is the aesthetics of these papers and how they operate internally. So everything not only cross-refers, but also two parts of it pull apart and make claims visible. So all of the countries that are, I should just say one word about this. This paper was prompted by the shift in the university system in the UK, where faculty were required to monitor the presence of foreign national students. And there's a kind of another layer of scrutiny, an extension of the university, or the university becoming kind of co-opted as a border agency. And there was, so this was an issue, again, that wasn't being properly talked about publicly, but nevertheless, the university is used as a kind of site of the administration of foreign national students, very kind of explicitly. And anyway, so this paper is really dealing with trying to reveal, if you like, again, some of the complexities about the claims of a university as being an egalitarian space, but really internal to its systems. There are all kinds of hierarchies, and especially a lot of scrutiny and surveillance of foreign national students in the UK. So it kind of had a kind of potency, especially as this came out in the first year in which this kind of administrative shift had occurred within the UK. And I'll just quickly flick through the images. So yes, everything cross-refers. These is a kind of parody of student surveys, which are conventional within the universities in the UK. You're meant to, students are meant to fill out a survey. This is, again, prompting the kind of underlying racism that persists within the system. Articles are juxtaposed with academic approached and solicited to key, very important writers on citizenship studies, with personal stories coming from some lecturers of what it was as foreign nationals themselves working within the system. And an interview with somebody in the immigration services next to an advert for the Precarious Workers Brigade, an activist organization which were also pushing back at, if you like, the kind of problems of the university as a bordering regime. So as you can see, it's this kind of cross-sectioning collage. In a sense, this is an assemblage of text and images that, as I say, continue to cross-refer. The property pages, obviously identifying all the security systems that go with kind of commonly practiced within the UK. And this sort of more explicit kind of prompting a provocation of kind of racist, underlying racism within the kind of way of thinking about universities. So yeah, sorry it took longer than I should have. Yeah.
I thank you.
Thank you.